So in response to that evaluation by UNICEF, the UN passed a resolution that began the Oil for Food program. The plan here was that, okay, we've blocked Iraq from selling its oil for this long, but what we'll do is we'll let them sell a little bit of oil, just enough to satisfy the needs of the people and buy food and medicine. Even if it had been completely running smoothly, without a drop of corruption, it could not have touched the needs of the Iraqi people at that time. But of course, it was rife with corruption. Saddam Hussein was selling oil on the black market behind everybody's back. But he was also wheeling and dealing with then CEO of Halliburton, Dick Cheney, who was also making lots of money from interactions with this oil-rich country. So the Oil for Food program was started in December 1996, but it did not touch the disaster, the humanitarian disaster that was created by the sanctions. By 1997, UNICEF was reporting nearly 1 million children in southern and central Iraq are chronically malnourished. This was an increase of 72% since 1991, since the Gulf War and the start of sanctions. The UNICEF representative in Baghdad said, "It is clear that children are bearing the brunt of the current economic hardship." So once shock and awe came along, and came the destruction of Iraqi society, again with no law and order, this added to the suffering of women and children, again because those are the segments of the population who suffered the most. This was technically the end of the economic sanctions, but there continues to be severe economic dire straits for the Iraqi people. And at this time, after the shock and awe invasion, the borders wide open. This was again our failed responsibility as the occupying power to secure the nation that was being occupied. And I remember when I went into the country in 2004, we were at a designated entrance point into Iraq, coming from Jordan into Iraq. And there was one guy in the booth that was far away from where we parked the car for inspection. There was one guy stamping passports. I never saw him because my cousin took my passport and got it stamped. Nobody looking at the card, nobody asking any questions, nobody checking. They had like you see at like a Jiffy Lube. I don't mean to use corporate names, sorry, but they have the opening in the ground where the mechanics can work under the car. Same thing at this checkpoint. They had a hole in the ground. You're supposed to drive your car over it so they could inspect and make sure nothing was coming in. I mean, that's a repressive regime. Nobody was there. We could have come in and gone out with anything. So the borders were, and that was a designated entrance point. You have thousands of miles of desert sand that were wide open. And what happened was, and my cousins told me it was the same thing that happened after 1991 when there was a breach in law and order, was that militias crossed over. This is my family's in Basra in the south. The religious militias from Iran crossed over, heading towards Najaf and Karbala, which are the major religious cities specifically for Shia Islam. So once you have the religious militias coming in, representing conservative religious parties, you see a decline in women's rights. And we have actually facilitated the rise of these very conservative parties in power. The current Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, and his predecessor, Ibrahim Jafari, are both from the very conservative Dawa party, which was based in Iran, and they have gained more strength with their positions in the green zone. So I want to show you these pictures. These are pictures, again, I found at my uncle's house. My dad didn't comment whether or not he looked good in these, but anyway. So this is my father over here. This is from the late 1950s at Baghdad University. So you see how the women are dressed. It's very westernized dress. Certainly anybody could have covered their hair at that time, but there was the option not to. It was a freedom of choice at that time. So a couple years later, this is 1961, there's my dad, you see, I don't know if you guys, okay, I didn't prepare you for this photo, but you see, oh my God, sleeveless right here. Nobody's covering their hair. This is how women were dressing. This is 1961. Now this one, I will tell you because I'm subject to the same stereotypes that any of us are, this one surprised me. This is one of my cousins in the 1970s, okay? Not a burqa. This was freedom of dress, freedom of choice, and also a society that allowed very progressive rights and progressive attitudes for women. This is in the 1970s. You know it is because look at his collar right there. I went back in 2004 to visit Basra. This is how we left the house. Now, I don't mean this to be a criticism of wearing the abaya, which is the traditional Iraqi, the black cloak, nor do I mean it as a criticism of covering your hair. My point is, it is no longer a choice. Now, there are, from what my cousins told me, you risk getting harassed if you leave the house without covering your hair. You risk getting harassed if you leave the house with makeup on. And it's calmed down a little bit now, but for maybe the first 4 or 5 years, you could not leave the house without being accompanied by a male relative. So women's rights and freedom of movement significantly set back. Iraqi women and children now, again, with a devastated economy, now between 1 and 2 million widows, tremendous suffering for Iraqi women as a result of our invasion and occupation. This is from an article that appeared on the BBC that Iraqi widows yearn for new lives, and I'm happy to send you the link. It's on my site. And if you define an orphan as a child losing one or both parents, there's an estimated 5 million orphans in Iraq now. That's 5 million in a population of somewhere around 27 million. That's the next generation. And they are devastated. Now I can say they are devastated, but as the saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is the tragedy, and this is not the message that's getting back on the evening news here for us to see. Oh, the other thing I should point out with that is that this little one, ask him what he thinks of Americans, when the only ones he will ever see thus far in his life are the ones who are walking the streets with M16s. This is the problem as well, that they don't see, they get a very skewed view, mostly skewed view of what America is representative of. So with the destruction of the economy comes economic desperation. With economic desperation comes a struggle for survival. And you add corruption, greed, and no security, and you end up with human trafficking. It's almost perfectly timed. So today in Iraq, well, this is actually an article from 2007. From 2007, it was an estimated 50,000 Iraqi refugees forced into prostitution. There are over 5.5 million refugees inside and outside of Iraq today. This is 20% of the population displaced because of violence, food insecurity, and the ethnic cleansing that has taken place under American occupation. This number from 2007 more recently came across the figure of 100,000. It's very difficult to know. But this is basically the husbands or fathers get killed, and this is survival sex. People, once they go to Syria and Jordan, refugees cannot work legally there. Everything is under the table. And even MSNBC covered that in 2007 in an article called "In Syria, Girls March as Time Bomb Ticks." And also HIV and AIDS and recreational drugs have become rampant in Iraq. So you end up with this corruption and human trafficking, and there's also an aspect of corporate slavery. So this is happening, basically it's being conducted by American-funded contractors in Iraq, like Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root, among others. What they do, now in this country, many corporations have closed up their factories, built them overseas where there are cheaper labor markets, so they widen their own profit margin. So people here at home are out of work. In Iraq, the American corporations showed up. They bring in foreign workers that are cheaper labor. There's tremendous unemployment in Iraq. So it's kind of the same system, all for the sake of corporate profit. These third country nationals are brought in from South Asia, Africa, and other countries in the tens of thousands. And what they do is they're specifically coming from countries with the lower wages, and the contractors move from country to country. I mean, this is a business in and of itself, seeking cheaper and cheaper labor markets. And these nationals, the people who are brought into work, are reporting that they get no sick leave. They're working, it's basically indentured servitude / slavery. 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Any attempt to organize leads to dismissal, which is not too far from what happens here. You have to buy your ticket home, and your monthly salary averaged out comes out to about 50 cents an hour, which is why corporations like this so much, because the profit margin is massive. Labor abuse, as reported conducted by these corporations. It was KBR got in trouble because they were confiscating people's passports, so then there was no means for them to leave, so they became trapped there essentially as slaves. The corporations used deceptive bait and switch hiring practices. There were these major recruiting fees, so you had to work an extended period of time to pay back that fee before you could even earn any money for yourself. And that's the appeal for the labor markets. I mean, these people are dropping everything and coming to Iraq to earn a big salary. That's the big draw. Oftentimes, the American corporations are bypassing Iraqi immigration procedures. They're living in very crowded housing with poor access to food, inadequate health services, and poor sanitation. I mean, this can also describe what's happening in this country and has happened for years with migrant workers. And unfortunately, that's the aspect of America that we've exported to Iraq. Iraqi children are paying the price and victimized. Children detained in Iraq by U.S. forces. By 2008, according to Human Rights Watch, at least 2,400 children are in U.S. custody, some as young as 10 years old. And the reason that they're bringing in these young children, they classify them as imperative threats to security, and they're allowed no outside legal representation. The reason for taking them into custody is basically extortion, which is illegal, but they're used, they want to draw out the military-aged male in the family, so they basically kidnap the child in order for the father or brother to turn himself in. The sale of Iraqi children, there was a Swedish journalist investigation that took place in 2008, I believe. They filmed the sale of children in a large market in Baghdad, selling infants all the way up to adolescents. In particular, this documentary shows the sale of a 4-year-old girl, sold her for $500. Now, this just isn't just anywhere in Baghdad. This is in the green zone. This is American Central Headquarters, and this is under the auspices of U.S. administrators and mercenary corporations. And there's a long history of it, which the more you dig into this, the more disturbing it gets. In the 1990s in Bosnia, the security contractor DynCorp, a whistleblower, witnessed co-workers and supervisors literally buying and selling women for their own personal equipment, and employees would brag about the various ages and talents of the individual slaves they had purchased. This is the nature of our occupation. This is the reality that's going on the ground that is not coming to light, and there's nothing to feel good about here. Armour Group, which is a British-based firm, in Afghanistan in 2009, employees were accused of visiting brothels that were enslaving young girls, which is also illegal by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So that's my conclusion of the very grim picture of Iraq today. Briefly on Afghanistan. Well, this is a picture of me at 4 years old in our backyard in Basra. I am not responsible for hair or wardrobe in this photo. But at that time, life was good. This was the 1970s. I was fortunate and had a very promising outlook. And for better or worse, this is where I am today. But this little one, unfortunately, in 2008, her parents were killed by a NATO airstrike in Afghanistan. Now that significantly limits her prospects for a good life. But that's the other aspect. These are the pictures on the ground that we're typically not seeing. So what I want to offer, and maybe I might be preaching to the choir, but in case there's any new information I can offer to you, typically Afghanistan has been labeled as the good war, although I know that's changing slowly today. But when Barack Obama came into office, he wanted to switch from Iraq, falsely claiming that all combat troops had left Iraq in August of 2010. We still have 50,000 troops on the ground there, but he redeployed an extra 30,000 to Afghanistan. But it's important to note the voices opposed to that occupation by NATO, led by the US and Great Britain. We usually hear the Bush-Obama-Karzai line, but I think it's important to point out the voices of the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association. They have a website, rawa.org. The voice of Malalai Joya, who will actually, will be in the U.S. speaking. She will be in the Boston area next week or the week after. And Afghans for Peace, which is a new and growing organization among Afghan college students here, the Iraqi Americans, and they're calling for an end to the occupation. So basically the take-home point is, yes, the right thing to do is to get out of Afghanistan. Malalai Joya was elected to parliament after the invasion of Afghanistan, and she notes how she was also often pointed to as a success story because she got to be a woman in parliament, but she became very outspoken against the occupation. And what she said is, my country hasn't been liberated, it's still under the warlords' control, and NATO occupation only reinforces their power. The government headed by Hamid Karzai is full of warlords and extremists who are brothers in creed of the Taliban. Many of these men committed terrible crimes against the Afghan people during the civil war of the 1990s. A troop surge can only magnify the crime against Afghanistan. This is another, her articles continue to describe what's happening. By installing warlords and drug traffickers in power in Kabul, the US and NATO have pushed us from the frying pan to the fire. The people, remember I said that every country is made up of families. It is those families who are trapped between warlords of the Taliban, warlords of the Northern Alliance, and NATO airstrikes. My people, the poor of Afghanistan, who have known only war and the domination of fundamentalism, are today squashed between two enemies, the US-NATO occupation forces on one hand, and warlords of the Taliban on the other. We're not helping. So another aspect, just to emphasize the aspect of human trafficking, is the trafficking of young boys in Afghanistan under America's watch, under the occupation. This is an article that came out on antiwar.com in April of last year. There was also a documentary on Frontline around the same time discussing the phrase, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's bacha bazi, which is an old Afghan tradition. Literally, it means boy play. And young boys are dressed up as girls, they perform and they dance for older men. They're essentially enslaved as concubines, and then when they turn 19 years old, they're set free. They're too old for that anymore. This is a very lucrative practice. Now it's become another aspect of corruption in Afghanistan. And it is taking place under the auspices of, and run by the commanders and warlords of the Northern Alliance, who are our allies in our occupation. Now what happens is people go to the poorer families in the rural areas. Many of them are starving because in addition to war and occupation, Afghanistan is experiencing a drought that worsens from time to time. And these families, they cannot feed their children. So people come from the big cities and they say, I will take your child, I will take your son. They pay them. We'll pay you money for your child, and we will give him a good life. We will take him to the city, he will get an education, he will get a job, he will be a success. But oftentimes what's happening is that these children are incorporated into this human trafficking. And if they don't have parents to look out for them, orphans on the street are taken up for this as well. In 2008, Canadian soldiers and chaplains blew the whistle because there was an alleged rape of an Afghan boy by 2 Afghan military personnel, that's Northern Alliance military personnel, and that took place on a Canadian forward operating base. So unfortunately, the Canadian Forces National Investigation Services claimed they had no jurisdiction over Afghan soldiers, but what was happening is that those whistleblowers, the Canadian soldiers who who recognized what was happening, when they came home, they were demonstrating symptoms of PTSD. So it's a gift that keeps on giving. There are victims all over the place. And with the NATO soldiers witnessing what's happening, it gets very confusing in their minds of who are they fighting for, what are they fighting for, and how can they live with it. So basically, human trafficking and the whole conduct of Western forces in the occupation, this is on our watch. We are obligated to international law, and we stand in blatant violation. The trafficking rings are run by those funded by American tax dollars and by British money. So our obligation is to end the occupations. We have our own problems to fix, and so I continue to call for immediate unconditional withdrawal. And as we're continuing to remove forces from where they already are in Western Asia, other people are saying, please don't start it with us. Please leave us alone. This was a sign put up probably a week or two ago in the early stages of the revolts in Libya. Now, I do want to point out that it gets complicated now what's happening. I believe it started out as inspired by Egypt and Tunisia. These are people trying to overthrow a repressive government. But I just want to share with you that I do ask the question, this is a very elaborate sign here. It's not like in Egypt where the people were making $2 a day and they made their own signs. They were writing things on cardboard. This is a very elaborate sign. So I ask myself, who made that sign and where is the money coming from? No matter what, we have to ask, follow the money, and find out where it's coming from. But there are many voices that I'm seeing on contacts on Facebook that do not want foreign intervention because foreign intervention is foreign interference. So I want to wrap up with this. This is actually, it's true that everybody has an agenda, and this is mine. I grew up 12 years in the American school system, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, and I took with liberty and justice for all very seriously. This is me with my nephew, who was born and raised in Pennsylvania. This is me with two of my cousins who are born and raised in Iraq. And in my stubborn mind, I say that there should be no difference in the opportunities that these little ones face simply because of where they were born on planet Earth. Now, it may be naive, but frankly, in the year 2011, I think we should be there, and they should have every opportunity. Now, my government, if my government gets what it wants, they will raise this little one to pick up a weapon to go kill these little ones. And I'm not having it. Not while I'm here and I have a voice. So these are my bosses. This is who I work for. And again, with the concept of liberty and justice for all, there's an Arabic proverb that says, "Fear not the path of truth, for the lack of people walking upon it." And I believe we're seeing more and more people on that path every day. But for any of us, obviously this is my passion because it's very personal for me. But wherever you are in your life, just follow your heart. Whatever your passion is, if it's the environment, if it's the arts, if it's politics, if you can ask yourself, how can I do something to make betterment of this world and follow along your passion, then I think it's important for you, for me, for all of us to find your voice and speak out, because if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? I want to thank you all for your attention, but I want to use this as a thank you, as a segue for our next speaker, who has also been on quite a roller coaster of his own to come to the point of finding his voice and speaking out. And I do want to say that we're engaged, and it's not that it's because he thinks like this. I am not telling him what to say, so I want to introduce Ross Caputi. Thank you very much.